computer. So this particular video for the Layman Seminary is going to be my presentation or preparation for my presentation tomorrow in my advanced Greek class. And so the title of my paper that I just turned in is the presence or absence of the verbal aspect in the substantival participle. Now, I'm going to be speaking to a group of people that already know this stuff and want to see how all the concepts come together. I'll make a more of a layman type presentation later on, probably with my wife. But basically, I have this color-coded saying the presence is indicated by the red and the absence is indicated by the green. All right? And I have a continuum here, presence and absence here. And then it says verbal aspect in the substantival participle. Now, on this end, you have that verbal participle that's dependent on the verb. You have an adjectival participle, which is dependent on a noun, okay? And then you have that, that should say substantival. I'm glad I catch that. I'll fix that later. And so it's functioning as a noun, so therefore it's independent. It's not related to the verb at all. Okay, so that continuum is key to understanding this paper. Whenever we're interpreting a substantival participle, there's several different morphosyntactical functions from other parts of speech that are involved as it relates to verbal aspect. For example, a substantival participle is an adjective participle acting like a noun. In other words, it's a or you can call it substantival adjective. So the point is, if you look at it from the perspective of that, an adjective modifies a noun and therefore has no verbal aspect. Well, another thing that distinguishes the substantival participle from the adverbial participle is the presence of the article which nominalizes the participle. Well, if it nominalizes, it functions as a noun and therefore it has no verbal aspect. Well, another thing that's going on is that you have no mood when it comes to substantival participle, or any participle for that matter. Okay, and so I'm wondering, how do you explain that a participle can have verbal aspect when it has no mood? But we can talk about that later on. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people, whenever they talk about temporal participles, or they're relating to the main verb. And most grammarians believe that tense is only in the indicative mood. And so that relates to that. Then we have the aspect, well, a verbal aspect. So verbal aspect, for example, could be habitual or gnomic. But if it's something is gnomic, it's not really focused on so much of an action. It's the timeless truth. Now, Wallace does say that it's possible to indicate a habitual action in a gnomic type way. It's like a general principle. But moving on from that, I'll talk about this. So basically what I did in this paper is I'm moving diachronically. In other words, oldest from more to recent. And this is the oldest paper that I was able to find by W.A. Stevens in an article journal on the substantive use of the Greek participle. And he's using this term adjective first and adverbial first. So already in mind, you have this idea of the continuum, even though they're not using that language yet, as far as I found. And he believed that there was three main types of participles: adjective, substantively, and adverb. Okay. Well, as I was reading Burton's syntax, which is another older syntax, he makes reference to him, and he makes a confusing statement, and that had me digging even further. And like, well, what's going on? How do I understand this? And so that made me want to think about, okay, well, that was the classification of participles at that time. What about now? And so I came across Boyer's classification of participles that is in that journal that I just showed y'all. And so that helped me to see what was going on there. And then I found out that Boyer, in several places in Wallace, has influenced Wallace in his understanding of things. As far as in the bibliography, you see his name mentioned right there. Boyer, the classification of participles. It's like, okay. So now we're moving more into present stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that Wallace says about the substantival participle, about the verbal aspect and when it's present and when it's absent, and some of that stuff is kind of confusing. Um, so several years ago, I did a video with a reformed guy about First John 5:1, where we were talking about the relationship of the participle. I think it was either adjectival or substantival to the verb, and so it related to the idea of did regeneration precede faith based on that passage? Could a person make that argument? And so he was looking at this participle, but he was treating it like it was adverbial. And come to find out, he was pretty much sharing the same argument that James White was sharing, which James White was sharing pretty much the same argument that John Piper was sharing about this. And there's been all kinds of discussion about this particular passage. But my point is, at that particular time, I only focused on Wallace. And we had a good discussion about Wallace. And you can go back and you can see how we were trying to piece everything together in light of what Wallace said. And so that made me want to do further research into this. And then I started hearing about, that the a substantival participle is especially flat. In other words, it has no aspect whatever. It's just a noun. And if that be the case, then I wanted to know more about that. So being that I took this class, this gave me opportunity to take it. And so I started digging. And some of the more recent resources, I found Con Campbell's verbal aspect and non-indicative verbs, and he addresses the substantival participle. Okay. S.M. Ball also addresses the substantival participle. And what's unique about these two is they really flesh out arguments saying that even though it's a substantival participle, it still has verbal aspect. In fact, they make the argument that it even has temporal aspects and things like that. And they go through a whole study of them, which I will continue to build on through the years and stuff. So you have these guys saying, yes, it does have verbal aspect. It is present. So then I'm moving towards the more recent grammars. And so here we have Decker. And Decker mentions substantival participle. And, he pretty much does what all these other grammars do, is he talks about the participle being a verbal adjective and having verbal aspect, but then when he gets the substantival participle, nothing is said about how exactly that occurs. And it kind of leads you to the idea that these intermediate grammars don't really want to touch that. Yeah, Wallace touched some of it in his footnote, but hopefully there will be more clarification in that area. And, the fault may be with my understanding, not with these writers. So I just want to say that up front. Well, also, this grammar as well pretty much does the same thing. And when you're reading it, it's like, okay, the substantival participle it functions like a noun. And so you're wondering, well, where's the aspectual force? Does it have in there? And of course, it still goes back to the idea that participles are verbal adjectives. Here's the most recent intermediate grammar, and it follows suit and does the same thing. So going back to this previous slide, as we're coming to this passage and I'm fixing to show y'all at 1 John 5:1, I want us to keep in mind these ideas that if it's like an adjective, it has no verbal aspect. If it has the article and it's nominalized and it has no verbal aspect. If there is no mood, then how does it have verbal aspect? And then the other aspect is this: if it does have verbal aspect, it still can have a gnomic meaning, and so that can affect our understanding of things. So let's go to the slide. And so here it is. Pas hapiston hati Jesus estin e Christos ectu theu gegenetai. So right here, hapiston, there's your participle, your present substantival has the article participle, or possibly adjectival if this is the subject. And here's your verb in red. Okay, so this has been born And what they're arguing is that because this is present, then it's saying the one that believes has already been born, because they're taking the perfect as already happened or whatever. Well, like I said, if this is, and this is what happens a lot of times with the word, the one who believes, is that a lot of times it has a gnomic idea, and if that be the case, it's not making a reference whatsoever to temporal aspects of things. Also, if this is an independent participle, then it's not dependent upon here. Also, as I said before, this is indicative mood. It has an article, and it's pretty much if it's substantival or adjectival, it has no verbal aspect. So that leads us to here. This is that discussion I was mentioning earlier. I'll probably move this around later on in the slide where that naturally rose. Like I said, we had a good discussion. Here's the James White video where that's talked about, where he makes reference to also studying in John Piper in this. And so here's what I said in my paper. I said, proponents of the position that regeneration precedes faith have latched on to 1 John 5:1 because it contains a perfect verb, gegenetai, an articular present participle, hapistuon. They argue that this means that one can only believe because they have been born again. They treat the adjectival or substantival participle as if it's an adverbial participle. I mean, when you watch those videos, it's just assuming that this participle is related in a particular way. If Campbell and Ball's assessment is correct, then even a substantival participle has aspect. Okay, so what this means is that as I'm going through my study here, and I find Campbell and Ball making their argument for it, this is going against my hypothesis from the very beginning. It's going against my assumption from the very beginning that it was aspectually flat. So, but we still need to clarify this here. That assumes that this is not a time when the verbal aspect is reduced or absent, because Wallace and the other grammarians were talking about there are times when it's reduced and when it's absent. And that's what moves it on the continuum. However, the present tense may include a gnomic idea, and one must weigh the implications. So just recognizing, oh, it has verbal aspect, doesn't mean that the issue's over. There's more that has to be involved in interpreting the participle. So I said this study is not an exegetical paper, but hopefully this illustrates significant implications of theology that flow from understanding the presence or absence of the substantial participle's verbal aspect. Okay, and here's my conclusion of the paper. The substantival participle lies on a verbal adjective continuum, where the same grammarians will say verbal aspect is present and absent. They determine the degree present through several considerations mentioned in this paper. Where first-year grammars teach that a participle fits into three main categories, it is up to the intermediate grammars to introduce the verbal adjective continuum. However, without an understanding of advanced Greek, the danger is that one will overinterpret the substantival participle. This current student, talking about me, may underinterpret the substantival participle until grammarians provide more clarity for determining the presence and absence of verbal aspect. And so that's it. I'll see how I did on time. If y'all want to talk to me about this, y'all can. Like I said, it's possible I may be misunderstanding these people, but when you're in seminary, you got to do your best to study and write your paper and try to record your research and explain to people how you came up to that conclusion. I might have went wrong somewhere on that, but that's open for discussion, and I'm willing to be corrected. So God bless. Okay, so now I'm going to stop the feed.